Welcome to Narrative Machines, a theory podcast that explores memetics, myth, and propaganda, how our narratives define the limits of our political and personal identity, how they can be controlled, how this era may be consigned to myth just as it was defined by it. Previous drafts of these ideas were published in 2017 in Narrative Machines, Mythos Media, in 2020 in Masks, Bowie and Artists of Artifice, Intellect, University of Chicago, and in various now-defunct web publications. It is presented here in audio format for the first time with additional reflections and editorial. For more of the author's work in various mediums and formats, visit jamescurcio.com. You can also find more podcasts and articles about RPGs and collective storytelling at modernmythology.net. Episode 4, Masks All the Way Down. It is often half-jokingly said that everything went to shit when David Bowie died. However true that is, it is certainly the case that Bowie appeared unusually prescient when it came to the internet, and what its social significance would be, although he maintained an amount of pre-millenarian utopianism. One can find any number of quotations, especially from the latter half of the 1990s on this subject. For example, I think the potential of what the internet is going to do to society, both good and bad, is unimaginable. Or apparently riffing on Burroughs' expression about the nature of language, the internet is an alien life form. It's easy to forget how dismissive or indifferent much of popular culture was about computers and the internet still at this time, framing it mostly as a hobby or hangout space for weirdos. Perhaps this prescience is more akin to an optical illusion. He was already well on his way, having spent most of his life plumbing the rewards and dangers of the mask, before most people had even recognized the unmooring power of anonymity or the virtual. Although an ever-shifting world of masks may be navigable to aliens like Bowie, many have not found themselves so well equipped. The epistemic crisis, chapel perilous, call it what you will. This is surely the fraying future society he imagined when he penned the character or interlude, Algeria Touch Shriek.
I'm thinking of leasing the room above my shop to a Mr. Wolof Domberg, a reject from the worldwide internet. He's a broken man. I'm also a broken man. It would be nice to have company. We could have great conversations, looking through windows for demons, watching the young advance and all electric.
Digitization has yet to allow us to flee our material origins or temporal necessities. If we shut ourselves offline, we do not regain some unity with the silent heart of the world. Those who go permanently offline and return to the village of the future may find it is falling in on itself, the windows cracked and soot-stained. It is eerily silent, with not even the sound of coyotes howling in the distance. Occasionally, a stranger shuffles by, their gaze fixated on the glowing screen held before them. This is yet another possible guise of the end of history. We flee silence and stillness, self-medicated on endless distraction. Reality is a reality TV show where we compete to have human rights. Must we perform our relatability in front of a sea of semi-anonymous strangers to crowdfund our healthcare? I'm a little afraid of Americans, and a little afraid to tune in and watch the series finale. Our society is experiencing a crisis along the same fault line as Bowie and Mishima's obsession with masks. To see it, we must broaden our gaze beyond the contours of their lives, to see how a shared nostalgia for a future that never happened, a subtle form of romanticism that resides sometimes at the background and sometimes in the foreground of their respective works, bleeds into the crisis that is now, again, at our doorstep. The flattening of ethics into aesthetics has repercussions that not only span the past century, but also help define it. It formed the conceptual foundation of modernity, yet remains poorly understood. We all should have paid attention to the philosophical underpinnings of Mishima and Bowie's work, as they served, if nothing else, as a sort of canary in the mineshaft. This and the subsequent 2 episodes will be an attempt to begin to do exactly that. First of all, we must recognize the nihilism that they dealt with in their art. which arose during an era when superpowers mutually exhausted one another, for surely that is a narrative that spans the globe. In 1936, Walter Benjamin wrote that Europe was a society whose self-alienation has reached such a degree that it can experience its own destruction as an aesthetic pleasure of the first order. He concluded, "All efforts to render politics aesthetic culminate in one thing: war." In the essay that quote comes from The Work of Art in the Age of Its Technological Reproducibility, he says that authenticity, or what Benjamin refers to as the aura of a unique work of art, is transformed by the reproducibility afforded by technology. As soon as the criterion of authenticity ceases to be applied to artistic production, the whole social function of art is revolutionized. Instead of being founded on ritual, it is based on a different practice: politics. Here we see the transformation from ritual to politics. But what has actually changed? Benjamin's concept of the aura, upon which the rest of his essay seems to depend, is possibly the weakest part of his formulation. Even he seems to acknowledge the conceptual vagueness of an aura of authenticity, describing it as a strange tissue of space and time. That significance that art, when a part of a ritualized tradition, was not outstripped by the industrialization of the mechanism of its deceits. Nevertheless, he develops a dialectic between tradition and authenticity, and reproducibility and upheaval. This mirrors Marx's distinction of use value and exchange value. Aura comes from the magical power that was ascribed to the aesthetic object in the beginning. It grants the object a use in the context of a magical universe where symbols have objective existence. In the context of Bowie and Mishima's work, a strict dialectical formulation is unnecessary, and consequently, so is a deeper analysis of Marxist theory for our purposes here. Suffice to say that despite ritual being carried out even in these modern guises, and the aura remaining as it ever was, a potent lie, an alchemical fabrication, and despite the distaste such words as artificial evoke, we can worship at the altar of artifice just as well as if we stood before one draped with the literal shroud of Turin. Significance is signified. The sacred can be everywhere, if it is anywhere. On artistic grounds, Mishima's patriotism didn't require his literal death to make it real. Benjamin concludes,
"Let art flourish and the world pass away," says fascism, expecting from war the artistic gratification of a sense perception altered by technology. This is the consummation of art for art's sake. Humankind, which once in Homer was an object of contemplation for the Olympian gods, has now become one for itself. Its self-alienation has reached the point where it can experience its own annihilation as a supreme aesthetic pleasure. Such is the aestheticizing of politics as practiced by fascism.
In modern political performances, writes Richard Sennett in The Culture of New Capitalism, the marketing of personality further and frequently eschews a narrative of the politician's history and record in office. It's too boring. He or she embodies intentions, desires, values, beliefs, and tastes. An emphasis which has again the effect of divorcing power from responsibility. Not only from responsibility, but also from reality. Possibly one of the most quoted poems of the previous century, Yeats' Second Coming, does a terrific job of anticipating a core anxiety of the industrial and post-industrial worlds, which is maybe not so surprising when we consider modernity coming to self-awareness in the aftermath of the First World War. That is, of course, that the center cannot hold. Many generations separate us now from the outcome of that apocalyptic conflict and its sequel, yet the existential crisis, even the core political ideologies, remain fundamentally the same. We may find no better presentation of the reactions to this crisis than Baudrillard's Simulacra and Simulation. The surface has subsumed the possibility of an essence, a world with nothing sacred, copies without originals. Much of Baudrillard's book seems to react directly with today's headlines of the collapse of consensus reality, or the consensus that there is one, into the event horizon of what author-philosopher R.S. Bakker refers to as a semantic apocalypse. People are right to feel anxious, though this particular crisis is different in quantity but not kind from the sort of unmooring and acceleration which followed the advent of the printing press.
Even the pendulum is a false prophet. You look at it, you think it's the only fixed point in the cosmos, but if you detach it from the ceiling of the conservatoire and hang it in a brothel, it works just the same. And there are other pendulums. There's one in New York, in the UN building. There's one in the Science Museum in San Francisco, and God knows how many others. Wherever you put it, the pendulum swings from a motionless point while the Earth rotates beneath it. Every point of the universe is a fixed point. All you have to do is hang the pendulum from it.
Our primary method of engagement with the world is guided by principles of appearance. From that seduction, we arrive at our ideology, and around that, finally, the protestations and assurances of rationalization. At the same time, what most appeals to a given person is already influenced, if not determined, by their existing ideology. Oscar Wilde stated that beauty is a kind of genius, and the 19th century aestheticism movement sought to centralize such values. But this falls short of the scope of aesthetics' conditioning of cultural hierarchies and power dynamics. Much of what we refer to as culture is a collection of implicit aesthetic assumptions. Nietzsche's moral prejudices, as developed throughout On the Genealogy of Morals, flatten in similar fashion. Aesthetics exist as appearance. Beauty is only skin deep, as the popular saying goes. So we want to dismiss appearances as superficial, forgetting that in the sense of Deleuze's immanence, all that is manifest is one surface, or the arresting nature of the romantic impulse taken to its extreme, to possess, to become, to halt the imperfections of nature itself, and memorialize eternity within the field of time. We rarely think of our values as aesthetic, except within the context of the philosophy of art. Aesthetics either fixates on art criticism, futile attempts at constructing a neo-Aristotelian model of good art, or it is constrained to the context of art museums and galleries. Art is sequestered from life. The challenging and troubling issues raised so far in this podcast rarely seem to factor into the discussion. Wilken wrote of the psychological key to Bowie's Low. Everything becomes a reflection of the self until you lose sight of where the self stops and the world begins. That key applies to much more than a single album. Despite the frequent fetishization of logic across the ideological spectrum, lay arguments for or against a book or movie, a religion, a course of action, a political platform, a way of life all arise from evaluation of appearances. Rigorous disciplines manage to reduce this effect to some extent in their specific contexts, but an astrophysicist is still unlikely to maintain a view of world history unbiased by their deepest personal preferences and biases. Our aesthetics are inculcated and determined not only by what we see, but also how we want to be seen. Organs of sense provide raw data that is ordered and interpreted before we are made aware of that interpretation. For all that, we don't merely replicate whatever we have been taught, as if we begin as blank slates and repeat whatever we hear without variation or truncation, nor is it only a reproduction of our organs of sense and the billions of years of evolution that stand behind them. There must be an ongoing synthesis or dialogue between all of these various factors. This dialogue between the constitutive parts of a culture behave like a complex, non-linear system. Peter Watts's novel Blind Sight deals with the future implications of this with startling clarity.
Evolution has no foresight. Complex machinery develops its own agendas. Brains cheat. Feedback loops evolve to promote stable heartbeats and then stumble upon the temptation of rhythm and music. the rush evoked by fractal imagery, the algorithms used for habitat selection metastasize into art. Thrills that once had to be earned in increments of fitness can now be had from pointless introspection. Aesthetics rise unbidden from 1 trillion dopamine receptors, and the system moves beyond modeling the organism. It begins to model the very process of modeling. It consumes ever more computational resources, bogs itself down with endless recursion and irrelevant simulations. Like the parasitic DNA that accretes in every natural genome, it persists and proliferates and produces nothing but itself. Metaprocesses bloom like cancer and awaken and call themselves I.
Aesthetics comprises a field of idealized possibilities and desires that run through the whole of our daily lives, composed, among other things, of what we want to see and how we want to be seen. All our ethics might amount to the attempt to make that idealized vision a reality. This is why it's so easy to manipulate our politics through the gradual algorithmic manipulation of our social interactions, if it can be performed at scale for long enough. Performance is not only play, it is an obligatory part of social life. Our sense of values, of personal meaning, our hierarchies of authority and power, whether intentional or otherwise, even the pose of vulgar nihilism itself remains a performance that defines a personal brand. A strange fascination emanates from ambiguity, specifically the ambiguity between aesthetics and ethics, as in the realm of human interaction, all things seem and nothing is. The protestations of Hamlet be damned. There is no escape. If this were the whole story, then art is propaganda and remains nothing other than an instrument of some power, and whatever reality it seeks to enforce. A popular 1984 quote lays the heart of the raison d'être of power, considered in the singular, more of itself.
Power is not a means, it is an end. One does not establish a dictatorship in order to safeguard a revolution. One makes the revolution in order to establish the dictatorship. The object of persecution is persecution. The object of torture is torture. The object of power is power.
The vested interests of powerful actors are to intentionally distort reality, possibly even to the point that there is no shared reality. This underlies the frequent accusations of fake news leveled both at and by the current president of the US. However, that obviously isn't quite right either. Rather, the appeal for truth in the media, whether CNN's 2017 "This is an Apple" advertisement or Fox News' old "Fair and Balanced," itself enters into the marketplace of ideas. A more apt metaphor might be a battlefield, especially when we consider the amount of capital, technology, and labor that states, corporations, and billionaires can throw at furthering their personal agendas. Cognitive biases, innate responses like tribalism, the myopia of fear, etc., are all leveraged via messaging, all around us, all the time. Often this reduces to an almost behaviorist, lowest common denominator feedback loop of what excites or engages us. René DeResta's elliptical but prescient 2018 essay, The Digital Maginot Line, explicates the true scope of this information war and the direction some of it is likely to take. It's notable how major world events are increasingly understood in the language of television, episodes, plot arcs, major players. Though this is in fact nothing new, the decentralization of media and information networks has hyper-realized the news broadcast. Consider the scheme presented in John Carpenter's cult film They Live, as interpreted by Slavoj Žižek in The Pervert's Guide to Ideology, where there is one true reality that underlies all the messages we are bombarded with. Nada puts on the glasses, and those covert messages are rendered overt. In the place of the soothing or arousing veneer of advertisements, he saw something quite new: obey, consume. A libidinal, behaviorist source code that underlies our simulation of reality. The perspectivist view is that reality is far more confusing and confused than any one truth can contain. All messages are in code. Every collection of data points can be fictionalized in any number of ways. To what purpose do we select one narrative over another? Zizek gives an essentially Marxist reading of They Live, and it is a good one. But these are his glasses. We can just as easily imagine a Randian objectivist libertarian read of the same movie. Our biases make artists of us all. All fictions stand in for the truth as they are repetitively performed. Think of all the implications people find in Chuck Palahniuk's Fight Club, or more accurately, in the Hollywood movie. The cult effect takes hold once a subculture gains a certain momentum. The mainstreaming of conspiracy news should not be mysterious in light of this. We never step out of ideology, but instead merely switch one pair of glasses for another. This is the fallacy behind cultural war reinterpretations of the prefabricated alternatives of getting woke versus taking the red pill. Tricksterish hoaxes such as the one William Boyd and Bowie pulled off by inventing artist Nat Tate read very differently in the context of fake news. In 2004, Latour's excellent essay, Why Has Critique Run Out of Steam? From Matters of Fact to Matters of Concern, raised the point that we can see critical theory's recognizable shadow when we encounter conspiracy theory and the alternate realities that outsider narratives can plunge us into. Latour explains,
It has been a long time, after all, since intellectuals were in the vanguard. Indeed, it has been a long time since the very notion of the avant-garde, the proletariat, the artistic, passed away, pushed aside by other forces, moved to the rear guard, or maybe lumped with the baggage train. Of course, conspiracy theories are an absurd deformation of our own arguments, but like weapons smuggled through a fuzzy border to the wrong party, these are our weapons nonetheless. In spite of all the deformations, it is easy to recognize, still burnt in the steel, our trademark, made in critical land.
There may be some small sense of misguided guilt in Latour's essay, as postmodern philosophers are not responsible for causing this epistemic crisis. Even the most popular quite simply don't have the social capital. They merely saw it around the bend a little sooner than most everyone else. How many of the most vocal critics of postmodernism have even read, much less understood their books? He was quite right, in any event, that a considerable amount of modern propaganda amounts to a reverse engineering of conspiracy theory thinking. We've actually seen it in practice for quite some time now. All the arguments engaged in for Holocaust denial, the moon landing, and so on provide a kind of template which are built into mimetic munitions with the assistance of the postmodern theory that has gained such a nefarious reputation, so much for its supposed self-referential uselessness. Without any intent to contribute further to the minor Red Scare that seems to have started in the US press, we still need to open our eyes and ask what exactly is going on. On the 26th of November 2016, The Intercept ran a scathing piece of the Washington Post's apparent citation of an anonymous group with opaque methods as a trusted source on Russian propaganda, saying,
The individuals behind this newly created group, prop or not, are publicly branding journalists and news outlets as tools of Russian propaganda, even calling on the FBI to investigate them for espionage, while cowardly hiding their own identities. The group, promoted by the Post, thus embodies the toxic essence of Joseph McCarthy, but without the courage to attach individual names to the blacklist. Echoing the Wisconsin senator, the group refers to its lengthy collection of sites spouting Russian propaganda as the list.
Compare that with something Adam Curtis said on the BBC in 2014.
Surkov is one of President Putin's advisors and has helped him maintain his power for 15 years, but he has done it in a very new way. He came originally from the avant-garde art world, and those who have studied his career say that what Surkov has done is to import ideas from conceptual art into the very heart of politics. His aim is to undermine people's perceptions of the world so they never know what is really happening. Surkov turned Russian politics into a bewildering, constantly changing piece of theatre. He sponsored all kinds of groups, from neo-Nazi skinheads to liberal human rights groups. He even backed parties that were opposed to President Putin. But the key thing was that Surkov then let it be known that this was what he was doing, which meant that no one was sure what was real or fake. As one journalist put it, it is a strategy of power that keeps any opposition constantly confused.
The sky is falling. Or maybe this is just more of the same, multiplied by states, corporations, and rich individuals starting to realize how technology and social media can be leveraged to wage a ghost army culture war in our heads. If this poses a return to the yellow journalism of the previous century, it is at least not unprecedented. We are not merely in a post-factual world, we are in a period where narratives are being weaponized, and we're free to pick our truth like it's a question of personal preference, vanilla or chocolate ice cream. For instance, might prop or not be forwarding a narrative from the Russian government themselves, directly or indirectly. It's certainly quite possible, yet it hardly seems to matter. Calling that into question shows just where we are in terms of trust. Once we trust no one to deliver even the basic facts, the mission has been accomplished, even if it turns out we did it to ourselves. A war in the virtual needn't be relegated to hacking attacks, or perhaps better stated, the ultimate target is the human behind the machine. After all, if the Russians did affect the US elections in 2016, it wasn't by hacking the election directly. It was through the oldest exploit in the book, and they weren't the only ones who are turning in this direction. One may look just as much at Cambridge Analytica, a company that supposedly used psychometrics to help manipulate the Brexit and Trump elections at the source.
In the 1990s, you couldn't use administrative structures to rule. We had to work through the reality we created instead. Politics in Russia is not just a form of theatre. You have to build the theatre as well. Gleb Pavlovsky, a former Putin spin doctor, 2007.
Bowie's Andy Warhol, Silver Screen, can't tell them apart at all, is now true as a general statement about hypermodernity, despite the fact that Warhol himself reportedly didn't like the track much at all. Whatever we think a mask means is what it means, countering illusion with illusion, now that we've entered what Simon Critchley refers to as a post-philosophical era. Meanwhile, on the internet, we may have reached what Max Red called the inversion in a 2018 editorial on the New York Magazine. Everything that once seemed definitively and unquestionably real now seems slightly fake. Everything that once seemed slightly fake now has the power and presence of the real. Berlusconi once said, "What is on TV exists. What is not on TV does not exist." In his book, The Invention of Russia, Arkady Ostrovsky writes about how the Kremlin took this one step further, so that things that did not exist could appear on television through the alchemical power of the image. All political figures engage in a form of kayfabe, and we participate as relatively minor demiurges, creators of reality, in the realm of social media. We must remember the way that Russia has reinvented itself through myth and media, detailed in Ostrovsky's book, which should be a touchstone in any study of current events in the US and UK, as well as post-Soviet history. Though American history is equally unique in its trajectory, there are considerable overlaps with the propaganda strategy of right-wing outlets like Fox News and post-Soviet media, which we may discover is not entirely incidental. As America seems to be going through its own stages of collapse, we may do well to take notes from this period of post-Soviet Russian history, although that is not to say that it is in any way determinative. The mythic karma of one nation varies from another in the same way that any nation is the product of our thoughts. Currently, we are still mostly in the denial stage. The methods used in creating alternate realities are also quite familiar to anyone with a background in alternate reality games, ARGs, which arose in the early net and zine culture of the 1980s and 1990s at the hands of people such as Joseph Metheny. However, and this is absolutely essential, the intent of these works was to broaden the scope of creative possibilities and was never in any sense to further political objectives. Here is what he said in Transmedia. Who invited the lobsters anyway?
As one of the developers of the literary style, now referred to as transmedia, and it was started as a literary style, regardless of how Johnny-come-latelys and interlopers may attempt to spin it these days, I'm here to tell you that it was never intended as yet another marketing gimmick. Hands down, no exceptions, not part of the plan. Transmedia and its immediate predecessor, alternate reality gaming, are hybrids of traditional literary narrative, video game story arc, web-enabled interactivity, and real-life role-playing games like LARPs. The original intention was to broaden and open up the storytelling process to mediums outside of the traditional publishing platforms, i.e., text images. It was part Borges, part George Coates, part The Game, the movie with Michael Douglas, and part other things.
This method included playing characters online, interacting IRL, and generating a self-consistent world of media that support this alternate reality. Method is ethic agnostic, as methods and symbols can always be reappropriated by new actors. This isn't to say that Putin's media network consciously co-opted ARGs, though Metheny has indicated that it's not outside the realm of possibility, but rather that ARGs were a response to changing mediums, which GovCorp media machines have also come to adapt to. Of course, there is also the now infamous Internet Research Agency, which ran numerous Kremlin disinformation campaigns. Many of Metheny's most popular transmedia narratives, such as Ong's Hat and El Centro, were active parodies of conspiracy thinking, at most raising the spectre of all the fictional possibilities posed by the unknown unknowns, yet they were often quickly adopted by conspiracy theorists, much to his consternation. People still hunt the Pine Barrens of New Jersey for the fictional Ong's Hat. In 2004, the signs were clear for those who knew where to look. Now we are in it. These are topsy-turvy times in even the most literal sense, so this can only serve as an instructive example. The potential for the creation of entirely fictional individuals is not new, but the danger of this being automated in video, image, text, and even audio, as so-called deepfakes, is absolutely real. If the US government wasn't already as fully committed to this game of asymmetrical cultural warfare as much as the Kremlin, it was purely because their position made these tactics seem unnecessary. The future is likely to include yet more layers of fictional narrative, not less. If we recognize that reality is fundamentally a conflict over the power to define how the world is interpreted, a mythic construction, do we also recognize that it operates on dynamics that have absolutely nothing to do with the reality of our dearly held moral values? We must be very careful that we do not mistake the real for reason. Whilst the relationship between aesthetic and social value may be impenetrably problematic, it is also dynamic, fueling the systems of relations that drive capitalist society. To see how the mask, as wrestled with by Bowie or Mishima, has been blown up to the scale of a society-wide spectacle, some consideration must be given to the mechanism that funds social media, a simplified, gamified mirror image of our group instincts. We perform relatability in search of approval, acceptance, even the rush of opposition and outrage, because we are social animals. This includes all forms of media, since it's all digital narrative building of a collective sort, a profit-centric system that can be leveraged for any ideological purpose, so long as that actor has the resources to bring it about. Evolutionary biases can work against us. We're keyed to find threats, to have our attention drawn most by danger, and intense emotions are literally a threat warning to the body that says, "Pay attention. The cute kittens get adopted, and the ugly ones get exterminated. Outrage becomes an end to itself in an attention economy. Either accept it outright, or our outrage is sold back to us as a product, which fuels our compulsive use of social media to signal our opposition. We read what we read or vote for who we vote for because of what that image represents to us. All social behavior can be manipulated because we have come to understand that members of society should be evaluated entirely based on economies of relational value. A baby's cry is a crowbar, a form of leverage. Beauty, or really any aesthetic qualities that we valorize, can manufacture economies fueled by the push and pull of desire and shame. This is easy to spot in fashion magazines marketed for women, but it isn't just coincidence that the men Michelangelo sculpted look like they could bench press a house. The knife cuts both ways. Neither the reductive, often quite misogynistic narratives of Evo psychology that claim men are genetically programmed to want sex with all blonde-haired, blue-eyed, leggy supermodels, nor the feel-good lip service of easy equality and everyone is beautiful campaigns. One, before the battle is ever actually waged, actually engages with the reality of beauty, its inscrutability, its arresting power of fascination, the ways it defines our values despite ourselves. Construct an aesthetic as a rebellion against, and you've only managed to identify a new niche market that can be exploited. So much for the revolutionary possibilities of commoditized counterculture. Facebook's entire front-facing business model claims to be about the almighty connection. This was quite intentional. Sean Parker, who served as the first president of Facebook, spoke to this in November of 2017 in an interview on Axios, and it is indicative of all we know about the social engineering that has gone into creating this business. The opiate of narrative keeps us clicking, the hunger in us that seeks validation, recognition, and amplification, the same craving that draws artists to an audience, and vice versa, is bait on the hook, and Silicon Valley is holding the fishing rod. We ask our collected pantheons of branded media to show us who we are, and hear nothing in reply except the far-off sound of a cash register dinging. Our post-industrial world is based upon utter reproducibility, and so we find that our identities are constantly at threat of utter commodification. As we drill down into the feedback mechanisms employed by the designers of these platforms, we are finding it reinforcing a sort of aesthetic hygiene, as utilitarian capitalist logic is increasingly applied to social interactions of all kinds, self-selecting the people we follow and oppose based on the messages they signal with, and more specifically, the virtues implicitly extolled thereby. We engage with our idea of what strangers represent, rather than with them as people. Meanwhile, virtue signaling is used as a common attack against activists, as if having virtues was the problem. Our digital shadow forms yet another mask, psychological profiles based on the phase space of our behavior, constructed through years of constant interaction with our smartphones, tablets, and computers. The real-world risks here should be quite evident after a genocide was incited on Facebook, at least in part by posts from Myanmar's military. It is unlikely it will be the last. How we got here is a long story in its own right, but perhaps one of the clearest examples can be seen in the adoption of a now doubly famous mask by the leaderless movement, anonymous, both in its mythic meaning and in the truth behind it. In books such as Gabriella Coleman's Hacker, Hoaxer, Whistleblower, Spy, and Angela Nagel's Kill All Normies, we saw the best parts of the movement came to embody an approach to activism based on the theory that, although there are bad actors online, in aggregate people are fundamentally good, the wisdom of crowds, and so on. The many various and disparate people involved in these movements also experienced the protection of anonymity, a kind of mask that people can use for a variety of purposes online. In return, that mask became symbolic, quite literally, of the movement. According to Nagel in that book,
in many of the events that were considered part of the leaderless revolution narrative, the Guy Fawkes mask was adopted as a central symbol. But the online origins of the mask and the politically fungible sensibilities that can be traced back through the mask should have offered a clue that another very different variety of leaderless online movement had potential to brew.
Many thought anonymity would be freedom, and discovered something quite different. However, Greg Hoosh, who became one of the more public faces of the anonymous movement, explained to me just how much mythology played a role in this history.
Nagel, like many others, has this romantic view of the mask and its use throughout a lot of modern activism. I wish I could tell you a great story involving feelings, emotions, car chases, but I can't. Here is how the Guy Fawkes mask was chosen for the first large, worldwide anonymous protest in February 2008. We had no idea what we were doing. We were a small group of anons from 4chan, sitting on IRC and accidentally starting this whole anonymous thing, with a few posts and a video, the message to Scientology. With no knowledge of how to do any of the things we were about to do, we just stumbled along. At one point, we decided that having 10,000 plus people on an IRC server waiting for instructions, we should ask them to protest worldwide in a few weeks' time. Having no idea what we were doing made this easy for us. We had no reason to think we were making horrible mistakes, but we absolutely were. We needed more time to plan, more time to organize, and far more time to figure out how to protest. Without that, we just made it up as we went along. About a week into planning, the small chat channel that was organizing all of this, Marble Cake, ran into a problem. We wanted everyone in the world to have some sort of single image to unify the protests. Events were going to be happening in 142 cities in 43 countries. We quickly realized we had a problem with shipping. In a lot of those cities, we didn't have time to get anything shipped to these cities if people ordered them. A group of us spent almost 24 hours straight calling comic book shops, costume shops, and other stores in every major city in the world. We started in Sydney, Australia, and ended in Los Angeles. In the end, we only found one mask in stock and cheap in every city we called, the Guy Fawkes mask. We went back to the others in our little group and told them the news. This was a completely practical and logical decision with nearly no emotion. After that, we made a bunch of material to put out that asked everyone to use the Guy Fawkes mask. Lucky for us, everyone seemed to love it. The mask itself took off after that and started being used in protests and movements all over the world.
Like any myth, the symbol of the mask fulfills a psychological need, one that is deeply linked to the massive challenges our societies are currently experiencing and will likely continue to experience in the near future. Masks all the way down. Deleuze's statement in Difference and Repetition. The masks do not hide anything but other masks. The same thing is both disguising and disguised, begins to make more sense. In this future we have come to inhabit, identity is both performance and commodity. The virtual can only usurp the manifest by trading place with reality, which is to say, consuming increasing shares of our attention. Modern life demands, if nothing else, constant distraction and dissociation. The internet is well wedded to that, even if it wasn't purpose-built. We yearn for something we can never fully satisfy, a curated reality that can be controlled like the virtual can. Fragments of identity bob along like flotsam, friend and stranger can come to mean nearly the same thing. The tracts of signifier and sign that we have strewn over a lifetime across the internet. A curated identity and history that is not the life we've lived, not quite an echo or even a reflection, but something quite else. The virtual self as cargo cult. Writing and recording is compulsory because it promises the immortality of mythos. We try to cocoon and thereby save what in ourselves can ever be saved. It is a play fight, and one we always lose in the end. Once adrift in that ocean, the problem remains, and in a sense, heightens the anxiety. And here we speak to a generalized kind of anxiety, a culture in a state of ruptured self-relation, more than a personal or particular sort. If you are aware that identity is a manner of performance, it is at best a seduction. Two lies told to create one shared truth, at least for tonight. Then you can continue, even though you recognize it will vanish on light of day. A person alone on an island survives, but no longer a cell in a larger organism. They become, at least for a time, no longer entirely human. Ultimately, the urge to delete all our digital simulacra and vanish into the wilderness tends to pass, not because it gets better, but because it wouldn't actually change anything. Without even the facsimile of a community, a common referent that goes beyond shared pop cultural reference, our masks are just chattering at one another, repeating forgotten histories for no one. Identity is tattooed on emptiness, a series of potentials, variations on a theme, many iterations, simulacra blindly wandering in an orbit around the black sun, that locus of the unseen and unheard, the subconscious of surrealists, and land of the dead, Burroughs' Western lands. But what gods and demons we can invent from our reflections. You have been listening to Narrative Machines. More work from the author can be found at jamescurcio.com and modernmythology.net. To support the production of work such as this, visit patreon.com/mythosmedia.